And greetings, saints of the Most High. In some cases, I'll say Shabbat Shalom, saints. In other cases, Shavua Tov, and so forth and so forth. I want to welcome you to this special installment of the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. I want to thank you for fellowshipping with me here today. And as always, it is our hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections, the Messianic Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections, finds you, your families, and fellowships well and blessed. This, as I said, is a special installment of the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections, because this is sort of one that I came into being led to do sort of in the last minute. Last minute may not be accurate. Last 3 or 4 days, which wasn't on my to-do list for the podcast postings. But because Hanukkah is here, because Hanukkah is, well, depending on which, well, we'll get into that as well. I'm getting ahead of myself. But this post is entitled Hanukkah, Truth and Spirituality versus Traditions of the Rabbis. So, as I'm recording this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections, depending on which calendar you're using, many Jews and Messianics around the world are celebrating or observing the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Now, if you're new to our faith community, Hanukkah is not a mandated feast of Yehovah. Now, most of you who listen to this program have been in our faith community for a period of time, but we do get our fair share of newbies to the faith, as well as we get folks who are exploring or just looking or truth-seeking, and they have questions. They haven't committed to the faith, but they're interested in the things of the faith as they are working out their own salvation with fear and trembling. They're looking at where does Father want or is leading them, and they will ultimately, Abba willing, make a good choice to come into the faith, establish a trusting, true covenant relationship with the Creator of the universe. But anyway, if you are new, it is not one of the mandated feasts of Yehovah. It's not, you won't actually find Hanukkah in Torah as a mandated feast or holy day of His. You actually have to go to the apocryphal books or the extra biblical books of the Maccabees. And there actually are like 8 books of the Maccabees. And we'll kind of touch upon that in just a bit. But that's where you actually find the basis for this national Jewish holiday. But as you will come to learn in our discussion here today, it is a celebration that was put into place by one of the Maccabean leaders. And it was put in place to honor the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem after Antiochus Epiphanes defiled it. And since that time, Hanukkah has been a holiday practiced by mainstream and Orthodox Jews. And all indications are that even Yehoshua, even in his day, celebrated, or at the very least, recognized the holiday, the national holiday of Hanukkah. And if you're interested, you can find that very brief passage of this in John chapter 10, verses 22 to 23. Now, you have to understand that it is referred to as the Feast of Dedication. Okay, so you're not going to find Hanukkah spelled out. So when you go there and you pull up that John chapter 10, verses 22, 23, and you see, oh, it's the Feast of Dedication. Now, he didn't say anything about Hanukkah, Rod, you're off your rocker. Well, yes, I am off my rocker, but not in this particular case. I'm off my rocker in a great many other ways. I'll admit that, but this is alluded to here, that the Feast of Dedications the holiday of dedication, however you choose to articulate it, was Yehoshua was present, at least in one. It's recorded that he was present there in Jerusalem during that feast. Now, I realize there are many within our faith community who are strongly opposed to Yah's set-apart people having anything to do with Hanukkah. And to a slight extent, I agree with them. To a slight extent. However, I believe, and this is just Rod, I believe the argument against Hanukkah observance by Yah's set-apart people should not be based on an argument against the keeping of a man-made traditional national holiday, such as Hanukkah, such as Purim, as opposed to the celebrating of a Jewish holiday that has been terribly twisted by traditions and falsehoods. Because that I certainly can understand. There are a lot of falsities, a lot of errors associated with Hanukkah, as well as Purim, which is coming up a little bit, that are not corrected by Judaism, but are rather fostered and encouraged by the religion. Unfortunately, some folks within our faith community, wanting to be more Jewish than being a disciple of Yehoshua, while they play fully into the frivolity and errors and misinformation of the holiday, as opposed to recognizing the true meaning behind this fascinating and important Jewish holiday observance. That being all said, it is my goal today to bring to the surface of a discussion on Hanukkah, a little bit of truth and spirituality that is associated with the true observance and meaning of Hanukkah. In other words, I can't cover the full significance, the full meaning, the full importance, the beauty of the Hanukkah story, and do it justice within a reasonable amount of time. It's just such a vast story that we're going to just touch upon a few things that struck me as I read through First Maccabees this past week, and that was the thing that inspired me to do this post. Now, when we talk about Hanukkah, you can't talk about Hanukkah in a general sense without talking about man-made traditions, in this case, rabbinic traditions. And there are a lot of them associated with this man-made holiday. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention, Hanukkah is an 8-day celebration, and depending upon what calendar you're using, let me take a look at my calendar here. Okay, now, according to the Jewish calculated calendar, which the vast majority of people within and outside our faith, as well as most of the Jews of the world, follow, Hanukkah began at sundown on November 28th. And it will go all the way up through Monday at sundown, December 6th. Okay? So it's an 8-day celebration. And there's a reason behind that. It's all found in the book of Maccabees, which we'll talk about briefly. But as many of you may, or for that matter, may not know about me, Hillary and I keep the observational calendar, which is the sighting of the renewed moon in the land of Israel, which governs when we begin and end each sacred calendar month. And so as I'm recording this post today, on 12/1 of 2021, we are on the first day of Hanukkah, the first day. last night at sunset was the day that we actually commenced Hanukkah. But today is the actual official daylight day of Hanukkah for the first day. And our observational calendar has us going all the way through next Wednesday, December 8th. I hate using those days of the week to talk about, but so as to keep going without having to explain what I mean by numbers and so on, it's the December 8th is when this concludes. So it's an 8-day celebration, and there are a lot, as I was just mentioning, a lot of traditions around Hanukkah, such as the hanging of menorahs on the wall or adjacent to mezuzahs, as neighborhood wine tasting, lighting of Hanukkah. Hanukkahs are an 8-prong menorah that is, or is it 9? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, I think it's a 9. It's a 9-prong, a 9-branched menorah that is used during Hanukkah, only during Hanukkah. There are 8 branches symbolizing the 8 days, and a candle is lit. One for each night of the celebration, with a center candle, which I forgot, it's like the master candle that you light all of the other 8 candles with, so forth and so forth. We don't have anything to do with that per se. We don't have anything to do with it at all. I shouldn't say per se, we just don't do that. But if that's your thing. But that is huge. That is huge, especially in Jewish homes, this lighting of the Hanukkah for each of the 8 nights of Hanukkah. There's also the food aspect. Fried foods are big. Jelly-filled donuts are big. There's also this mainstay for the children of exchanging gifts. It's their form. It's been likened to Christmas for children in Judaism. And so a lot of folks within and around our faith community, as well as in Jewish faith communities, that they will do their form of Christmas with the gift giving for the children and the decorations and the lights and all, to give their children a sense of this Christmassy motif, this mindset, this thinking of the gifts and the beauty of the lights and all of that their kids are missing because they're not keeping Christmas. So that's kind of, that falls into all of this as well. As well as there's the playing of the dreidels and so forth with the games and so on. Now, another name that is traditional for Hanukkah is that of the Festival of Lights, as well as the Festival of Dedication. And it is generally, as I said, kept 8 consecutive nights with special prayers rendered and a lot of fried foods. Now, the Hebrew term Hanukkah, spelled Hanukkah, is also spelled with a C in front of the H. So it's Chanukah. So you may see some variations in the spelling, and these 2 spellings aren't the only way to spell it either. So you may come across different spellings, but it's the same word, Hanukkah. And it means dedication. Thus, we get the Feast of Dedication name we find in John chapter 10 mention of Yeshua being at the Festival of Dedication. So Hanukkah means dedication, and it is aptly named in joyous acknowledgement and memorial or in memory of the rededication of the temple during the times of the Maccabees. And we'll get into that in just a moment. And from a scriptural standpoint or an apocryphal standpoint, it begins on the eve of the 25th of the 9th biblical month, which rabbinically speaking is the month of Kislev. Now, you never hear me mention these Babylonian months, name months, because I don't agree with using that. But invariably, you'll run across that. You'll see that. And I'm just for for purposes of reference here, so that we all know what we're talking about, and in case you run across this in your own research, you'll always see that, yes, it is on the eve of the 25th, the eve of the 25th of the 9th month, or the month of Kislev, the 25th. Eve is always talking about sunset the night before. Okay, and this year, according as I just mentioned, it runs from 11:28 through 12:6. Now, we're here today, and I'd like to share with you a few verses from First Maccabees that I found to be powerful and spiritually significant, and that I believe best underscores the true meaning of Hanukkah. Along the line of my reading these verses to you, I'll add commentary accordingly. So I really want to share these because, as I do every year when Hanukkah comes, that's the way I observe Hanukkah, as I read the book of First Maccabees, 1 Maccabees. And I spend those times, that holiday period, reflecting and thinking about the true meaning of what I'm reading and how it applies to my walk with Messiah. So primarily, Hanukkah is condensed into the first 5 chapters of 1 Maccabees. I think it's also listed in the other variations of Maccabees. As I said, there are 8 different sephers or books of Maccabees, but I'm primarily concerned and interested with 1 Maccabees, which I'll talk about in just a minute after I'm done the reading here. But I'll be reading from the Sefer translation of the Bible. And you find in chapter 1, verse 11, the following. In those days went there out of Israel wicked men, who persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us. For since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. Here we see indications of Hebrews who have determined within themselves that they want to compromise their faith by covenanting with the Hebrews around about them. They want to be just like the folks out there. They want to be like the secular dudes out there, the cool guys on the street. In this case, specifically the Greeks. So we have here within the very belly of Judaism a handful of folks, who knows how many, but enough that the passage would single these out as wicked men who decided that they want to bring the nation into compromise and be like the cool kids on the block, the Greeks. Verse 14, 15, and 16. 14 and 15, not 16. Same chapter 1. Whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the customs of the heathens, specifically the Greeks. Verse 15, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. Now, these 2 verses in chapter 1 of First Maccabees says so much. And I could spend the rest of this session together with you just picking these 2 verses apart and understanding what was actually happening in Israel during this time. But what we can see here is that, again, there's this huge move for compromising. And compromise always leads to a total abandonment of one's faith. At some point, you're going to eventually just completely leave. And here we have these folks who started off with wanting to build a gymnasium. They wanted to have like the Olympic Games coming around to Jerusalem. And so we're going to be like the Greek Olympiads. And because in those days, in ancient Greece and in some of the gymnasiums, the men participated in sports nude. And one of the problems with being Jewish and being athletic and participating in these athletic endeavors, especially in the Greek realm, was the Hebrews were circumcised. The Hebrew males were circumcised. And the perception by the Greeks toward even seeing or thinking about circumcision was abhorrent. They were disgusted by it. But now we've got these Hebrews who want to be like the secular world around about them. So the next step after building a gymnasium in Jerusalem is we got to do something about our circumcision. So they made themselves uncircumcised. I can talk about that a little bit later, but not today. There was a means that they could go about and undo their circumcision, as strange as that may sound. And then what's next? They forsook the Holy Covenant. They decided to turn their backs upon Jehovah and his ways, his covenant, his Torah, and abandon him. And then lastly, they wanted to completely join themselves to the heathen and participate in their mischief. Crazy, huh? That's what it takes. And we see that happening today. We see the compromise in so-called Christianity today. In the faith community, even in our faith community, where we have folks, leaders within our community, folks of renown in our community, inside and outside our community, who are suggesting that we just, we want to be like the rest of the folks. We want to bring unity to the body. And so let's just play nicely with them. And if we have to compromise on our faith principles, then, that's a small price to pay to be at one, to be at peace, to be respected and loved by everybody. And that's what happened here. And that's just skimming the surface. We could go deeper into all that has transpired in just these 3 verses I read you. Chapter 1, still, verse 41 through 43. Moreover, King Antiochus, king of the Greeks, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone, verse 42, and everyone should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king, verse 43. Yea, many also of Israel consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Shabbat. So we see how the compromise now has taken shape. Now that we are in with the heathen, speaking of Israel, now that they have completely decided to compromise the faith, now the king has decided, here's what we're going to do. You're going to follow my religion and you're going to abandon your religion. You're going to put away your Torah. And you're going to do what I tell you to do. You're going to sacrifice unto my gods. And you're going to abandon your Sabbath and follow my day of worship. Sound familiar? Absolutely. Verse 49 through 50. To the end they might forget the Torah and change all the ordinances. Verse 50, and whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. Now it's getting serious. Now it's to the point where the king says, you've sold your soul to us. There's no going back. There is no more Sabbaths for you. There is no more Torah and the Torah way of living for you. You are now bought and paid for and in my religion, under my instruction, my commands. This is how the enemy works. This is how the enemy works. Verse 51, commanding the cities of Yehuda or Judah to sacrifice city by city. Verse 52, Then many of the people were gathered unto them, to wit, every one that forsook the Torah. And so they committed evils in the land. So even though now they're being strong-armed into keeping the pagan religion of Antiochus Epiphanes, they've, by default, have brought evils upon the land of Israel. You can't turn your back and compromise the faith and think you're going to be in good terms with the Father, for one, and two, not bring evil upon the land. This is what happened here. Verse 54. Now the 15th day of the month of Kislev, the 9th month, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and built idol altars throughout the cities of Yehuda on every side. The abomination of desolation. Sound familiar? It's what we believe is going to happen in the believed to be reconstructed temple in the last days, where the Antichrist, some say, will sacrifice an abominable animal upon the altar, defiling it. We won't get into that today, but this is the first iteration of such a prophecy. Verse 57, and whosoever was found with any sefer of the covenant, or if any committed to the Torah, the king's commandment was that they should be put to death. Friends, we're not far from that today. We're very close to that actually happening today. Oh, we haven't gotten there yet, but we're getting there. There will come a time when we will have to make a decision if we're going to walk in Torah, walk in covenant relationship with our Father, and then as a result face death, or we give it up and live for that period of time. Compromise. This is beyond compromise now, my friends. This is now you have to give up your entire faith. Verse 59, now the 25th day of the month, they did sacrifice upon the altar, the idol altar, which was upon the altar of Elohim. Verse 60, at which time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. Verse 61, and this is so tragic, so touching. And they hanged the infants about their necks, the women who gave birth and sacrificed their children. They hung their babies around their necks and rifled their homes and slew them that had circumcised them. Talking about their sons. 62. Howbeit many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean things. You see, there's always a remnant. Hallelujah. There's always a remnant. Praise Yah. There is always a remnant. Not everyone in Israel abandoned Father and abandoned Torah. There was a handful of steadfast that stood firmly, and they paid the price. They paid the price. And we're going to be in the same boat here coming soon. Verse 62. Many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean things. Verse 63. Wherefore, the rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meats, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. So then they died. Faith comes at a steep price. And right now, many of us are living on God's grace. We can do what we're doing here today. We can fellowship without problems, without thought of being persecuted or tribulated. But there is going to come a time when we will have to answer the call and make a decision whether we will stand for our faith and pay the ultimate price, or if we will compromise and go fully on over to the other side. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees, beginning at verse 1. We're going to read down to verse 5. And it reads, in those days arose Mattathiyahu, or Matthias, the son of Mattathiyahu, which is Matthias, the son of Yehukanan, or we call him Yehochanan, the son of Shimon, a priest of the sons of Jorab, from Jerusalem, and dwelt in Modim. So we have here, speaking of Matthias, who was the son of John, the son of Simon, or Simeon, who was a priest, and they resided in Modim, which was a little country town over in Israel. Small, but there was a priest there by the name of Matthias. Verse 2, and he had 5 sons, Yehukanan, John, called Cadus, Shimon, called Thassi, verse 4, Yehuda, or Judas, who was called Maccabee. Pay attention to that name because he factors in very prominently here. In verse 5, Eliezer, called Avran, and Jonathan, whose surname was Aphis. So we have this family of priests here in Modim who will play a role in bringing truth and faith and spirituality, returning it back to Jerusalem after the great fall here of Yisrael under the force of the Greeks. Moving on over to verse 18 of chapter 2. Now therefore come you first. And this is a representative who came into Modim to try to coax the people of Modim to sacrifice unto the idols and to dedicate themselves to Antiochus Epiphanes' religion. Now therefore come you first, speaking of Matthias and his priestly sons. Come you first and fulfill the king's commandment, like as all the heathens have done. Yes, and the men of Judah also, and such as remain in Jerusalem. So shall you and your house be in the number of the king's friends, and you and your children shall be honored with silver and gold and many rewards. You see how the enemy works? He knew, I believe, this representative who went to Modim to entice the people in Modim to compromise their faith. I believe they recognized that these were very devout Hebrews, and it was going to be tough to get them to compromise, to come on over to their side. So this representative offers all kinds of enticements with physical riches, such as gold, silver, and other rewards, as it says. Verse 19, then Mattathiyahu, or Matthias, let's just put it that way, answered and spoke with a loud voice, though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the faith of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments. Verse 20, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. Verse 21, far be it that we should forsake the Torah and the ordinances. Verse 22, we will not hearken to the king's words, to go from our faith, either on the right hand or the left. And the passage says in verse 24 that he, Matthias, Mattathiyahu, was inflamed with zeal. And in verse 27, whosoever is zealous of Torah and maintains the covenant, let him follow me. You see, here's always a remnant, and that remnant is powerful. And here we have this handful of ragtag priests who stand up to the evil one and say, nope, as for me and my house, we're going to serve Jehovah. Praise Yah. Hallelujah. Chapter 2, verse 50. Now, therefore, my sons, be zealous. He's now, let me just let you know that they ended up killing the the representatives, and they took care of them pretty handily right then and there. And anybody in Modin who decided that they were going to go ahead and compromise, they took care of them as well. And so then going down to verse 50, it reads, now, therefore, my sons, he's talking and encouraging his sons, and he's passing a mantle on to them. He says, be you zealous for Torah and give your lives for the covenant of your fathers. Verse 51. Call to remembrance what acts our fathers did in their time. So shall you receive great honor and an everlasting name. Verse 52. And indeed they did receive an everlasting name. Verse 52. Was not Abraham found faithful in temptation, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness? In other words, have faith. Have faith. Trust in Jehovah, your Elohim, and his ways, and in the covenant relationship you have with him. And righteousness will be imputed unto you. In other words, if you do what Father tells you to do and you trust him implicitly in every level and aspect of your life, he will take care of you. And he will impute unto you his righteousness. Praise Yah. Verse 61. And thus consider you throughout all ages that none that put their trust in him shall be overcome. Verse 64. Wherefore you, my sons, be valiant and show yourselves men in the behalf of the Torah, for by it shall you obtain glory. Verse 65. And behold, I know that your brother Shimon is a man of counsel. Give ear unto him always. He shall be a father unto you. Verse 66. As for Yehuda or Judas Maccabee, he has been mighty and strong even from his youth up. Let him be your captain and fight the battle of the people. Verse 68. Recompense fully the heathen and take heed to the commandments of Torah. So here we have Matthias passing on the mantle of leadership to his sons after they fought against the heathen, the Greeks, who decided to try to take him out because they refused to compromise. But Father was with those handful of priests and this small band who was grossly outnumbered by seasoned warriors were able to overcome those seasoned warriors without problem. You see, this is the miracle of Hanukkah in great many ways. That a small band of hillbilly-ish folks that are unsophisticated, but they love their God. They love their life of Torah. And they were willing to stand against the enemy horde miraculously and be delivered, and to return a people to Jehovah and his way of life. Chapter 3, verse 5. For he pursued the wicked. Speaking of Judas Maccabees. He pursued the wicked and sought them out and burned up those that vexed his people. You see, it didn't just come with correcting and restoring the old ways. It was now he's going to make those who caused his people to turn away to pay. It was judgment time for the Greek hordes by this little band of warriors. Verse 17, who, when they saw the host coming to meet them, said unto Yehuda, this is the Yehuda's or Judas's band of merry men, if you will, saw this great army approaching them, they say to him, "How shall we be able, being so few, to fight against so great a multitude and so strong, seeing we are ready to faint with fasting all this day?" Verse 18. Unto whom Yehuda, or Judas, answered, "It is no hard matter for many to be shut up in the hands of a few. And with the Elohim of heaven it is all one, to deliver with a great multitude or a small company." Verse 19. For the victory of battle stands not in the multitude of a host, but strength comes from heaven. Strength comes from heaven. Enough said. Verse 20. They come against us in much pride and iniquity to destroy us and our women and children and to spoil us. But we fight for our lives and our Torah. Verse 22. Wherefore Yahuwah himself will overthrow them before our face. And as for you, be you not afraid of them. Praise Yah. Now, I want to jump on over to, there's so much here. There's so much here that I would love to share with you, but we're running short on time. But I want to move on over to chapter 4. This is the basis upon which the Hanukkah traditions of men were brought into the mixture of the true meaning of Hanukkah. This is chapter 4, beginning at verse 49. And let me preface this story as we're reading here, these few verses. The Maccabees and his band of merry men were able to rout the immense number of enemy hordes that came against them on a countless number of battles, and they beat them every single time. They were outnumbered overwhelmingly, and Jehovah miraculously delivered them. And not just delivered them, they destroyed them. They routed them. They thrashed them, as they would say. Yes. This is the basis of the miracle of Hanukkah, if you really want to talk about miracles. But then they decided to turn their hearts and attention to Jerusalem and the temple. And when they got there, they found that the temple had been destroyed by the enemy and had been neglected by the people because the people had turned away from Jehovah and his ways and from worship of the temple. So the temple had completely been sacked. It was trashed, literally. There were weeds and trees and stuff growing in the various areas of the temple grounds. Most of the implements of the temple worship system had been either stolen and taken by Antiochus and his hordes, or they were destroyed. The Torah scrolls were ravaged and destroyed, or just outright taken. The place was a mess. And so these priests, under the leadership of Judas Maccabee, go there to restore, rededicate the temple, put it back in place where it was before. And we pick up here at verse 49. They made also new holy vessels, and into the temple they brought the menorah and the altar of burnt offerings and of incense and the table. Verse 50. And upon the altar they burned incense, and the lamps that were upon the menorah they lighted, that they might give light in the temple. Verse 51. Furthermore, they set the loaves upon the table and spread out the veils, and finished all the works which they had begun to make. Verse 52. Now on the 25th day, 25th of the 9th month, which is also called month Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose up early in the morning, verse 53, and offered sacrifice according to Torah upon the new altar of burnt offerings, which they had made, verse 54. Look, at what time and what day the heathen had profaned it, even in that was it dedicated with songs and cisterns, and harps and cymbals. Verse 55, then all the people fell upon their faces, worshiping and praising the Elohim of heaven, who had given them good success. Verse 56, and so they kept the dedication of the altar 8 days and offered burnt offerings with gladness and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. Then moving on over here to verse 58. Thus was there very great gladness among the people, for that the reproach of the heathen was put away. Verse 59, moreover, Yehuda and his brethren with the whole assembly of Israel ordained. Here's where the holiday of Hanukkah was instituted. Verse 59 of chapter 4 of 1 Maccabees. Moreover, Yehuda and his brethren with the whole assembly of Israel ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept in their season from year to year by the space of 8 days, from the 25th day of the month of Kislev, or the 9th month, with mirth and gladness. And verse 60, at that time also they built up Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers round about, lest the other people should come and tread it down as they had done before. So there's a lot here. But as you may or may not recognize, the story of Hanukkah is indeed tightly embedded in the story of the Maccabees. However, much of the truth of Hanukkah has been lost by rabbinic tradition that took liberty with recorded history, and which is contained here in the Maccabees. And they sought to spice up that history somewhat. For according to the rabbis, when the Maccabees went to resurrect the temple and to light the temple's menorah, they were only able to locate a single cruse of olive oil. And that single cruse of olive oil was the only cruse of olive oil in the land qualified to be used to light the lamps of the menorah. Beside that single cruse of oil that the Maccabees recorded, the rest of the oil supply had been contaminated or profaned by the occupying Greeks. And as the story goes, however, that single cruse of oil burned miraculously for 8 days. The miracle of the lights. It miraculously burned for 8 days until such time that sacred oil could be prepared and used according to Torah. And thus we have here the rabbis take responsibility. They actually do. They take responsibility of this, of creating this Jewish holiday or festival to commemorate what we'll find out here in short order as erroneous miracles. This was nowhere to be found in our passage, if you recall. I didn't leave this out. As I mentioned earlier, the story of Hanukkah is tightly embedded in the story of the Maccabees. And that story of the Maccabees is recorded in the books of the Maccabees, or the Sefer HaMaccabeim, as it is referred to in Hebrew. I probably butchered it. And there are, as I mentioned, 8 books that bear the title Maccabees that can be found in various canons of the Bible. And primarily, there is 1 Maccabees, which was originally written in Hebrew. And unfortunately, the Hebrew that it was originally written in have all disappeared. There, we don't have copies of that. Maccabees 1 is primarily only found in Greek. And it records the history of the Maccabees from 175 to 134 BCE. Then we have 2nd Maccabees, which is a Greek abridgment, they call it, written by a Jason of Cyrene that records the history of the Maccabees from 176 to 161 BCE. And its main focus is on the leader Judas Maccabeus. And then, of course, we have the other 6 Maccabee variations that we won't talk about. Now, 1 and 2 Maccabees are considered canonical by the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which the remaining 6 books are considered apocryphal books. I have in my possession that I off and on refer to the Sefer Bible, and it does contain, I believe, 4 Maccabees, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. So In the Sefer, if you have one, you will find the 4 versions of Maccabees. Don't hold me to that, but I believe it is. Maccabees. Not that this is important. Yes. 4 Maccabees. The 4 Maccabees. Now, the miracle of the cruse of oil for the menorah of the temple that supposedly lasts for 8 days is a rabbinic invention. And it's found in Shabbat 21b, the Talmud. There is no record of such a miracle of 1 cruse of oil burning for 8 days to be found in the Sefer of Maccabees account. None. But this is the lie that certain rabbis fostered in order to spice up the holiday. Just so we know. So when we have this in mind, we have to ask ourselves, so what significance is the story of the Maccabees to God's set apart people? What is the relevance? Well, I personally believe Hanukkah is a time of reflection, a time of planning, a time of affirmation, of resolve, of dedication, of zeal, of covenant, of courage in the midst of an overwhelming enemy, of trusting faith in the delivering power of the Elohim of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, of Torah keeping even in the midst of overwhelming persecution, among several other things. It's a time for consideration of what we're going to do when they come for you, quite frankly, to borrow from that theme from Cops show in the 90s. Indeed, we are living in a great many ways in the days of the Maccabees, if you think about it. Because we see today how the so-called Christian leaders and their organizations have happily gone over to the side of the pagan government of this nation to promote and use their influence to coerce would-be people of God to severely compromise the very tenets of their faith. Now they want to unify with homosexuality. They want to encourage people to get vaccinated. They want to water down the word so as to not offend anybody. If you're a thief, we don't want to use the word thief. I'm embellishing. But there is this move to water down the word and go into this kind of milquetoast mentality of faith. To pledge allegiance to the primacy and sovereignty of the government. To promote the dissolution of the family even, to promote poverty in their communities as a means of encouraging and forcing dependence on the government, and so many more spiritual crimes. But we are all called to be as Maccabean warriors, because we are in a war, friends, for our very lives, both physical and spiritual. But our warfare is not like that of the Metathathayu or the Matthias ben Shimon or Simeon, the Matthias ben son of Simon, and of Judas Maccabeus. For our warfare is not against, as the apostle noted, against flesh and blood. Beloved, it's as Shaul taught that our warfare, unlike that of the Maccabees, it's not against flesh and blood. Instead, it is against principalities, powers, rulers of darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. But our fight is spiritual in nature, but our fight must also begin against our own flesh. So we have a war waged on 2 levels, a war against the enemy and a war against our own flesh. We have to learn to die to self We must have confidence in our calling. We must get rid of the personal baggage that we bring into our faith with us. All of these things and so much more, and I've put many scriptural references for your edification, if you will, in the show's transcript that you can find over at www.themessianictourobserver.org. Check out this post, and you can check out those references for your own notes if you're so inclined. But our warfare is very much like the Maccabees, but it's on a spiritual level. And it's also a warfare against our own flesh. Like the Maccabees, our captain, as opposed to Judas Maccabee, is our Messiah, our older brother, our soon-coming King, Yahushua Messiah. And we fight under the banner of Jehovah our Elohim. Our primary weapon in that battle is our faith, as mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 18 and 19. We conduct our warfare primarily then through faith, through our prayers. Psalm chapter 35, verses 1 through 3, and Psalm chapter 6, verse 18. And so we fight with all earnestness as we contend for the true faith once delivered, Jude chapter 1, verse 3. We stand watchful at every single moment of the day. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13, and 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. And in our standing watch and being watchful, we are sober at all times. Our mind is steadfast and unwavering. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6. We realize that our war requires steadfastness and endurance. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 3 and 10. And so, like the enemy, if we do these things, if we follow the example of our Master Yeshua and the teachings of him and his anointed apostles, we will like that Judas Maccabee and his band of merry men, I like to call them, the enemy will know who we are. And they will dread us. And we have to ask ourselves, does the enemy know who we are today and what we're capable of, such that they dread us? You see, so dreadful became the comparatively small forces of Judas Maccabeus to Antiochus and his immense army that he sent greater and greater number of forces, Antiochus, to fight against Judas, only to have them wiped out every single time. Do we have that much renown in us spiritually that the enemy out there fears us? Or that they respect us, more importantly? It's bad when you have been in a faith so long and been so complacent in that faith that the enemy simply pays you no mind, pays you absolutely no mind. You are of no consequence to them. We've got to get to that place where the enemy knows who we are and knows what we're capable of, knows the mantle that is upon us, and they respect who we are and what we stand for. And so in chapter 4 of 1 Maccabees, as I read, or Maccabees, we have that rededication of the overrun, defiled temple that the Maccabees rebuilt and purified. And so we find that Hanukkah is, among so many things that we've just talked about, also about the profane versus the holy, discerning the difference between the profane and the holy. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we in a place in our walk with Messiah that we are capable of discerning the difference between the two, the holy from the profane? For indeed, there is a stark difference between the two. And Jehovah's people are called to not only discern between the two, but to also do something about those things in their lives that are profane or profaned, and to guard those things that are holy. And we also realize that these bodies of ours have replaced the physical temple in Israel. And so we must treat our bodies, our whole self, as holy, rededicate it. And anything that may potentially defile it must be purged. And in some cases, we must rededicate, rebuild, replace those things. Our hearts, our bodies and minds for service, for worship, for housing the presence of Jehovah in this earth. Just as the Maccabees rebuilt and rededicated the temple in Jerusalem. So I would suggest that Hanukkah, despite it not being numbered among the feast of Jehovah, and especially as it falls here upon us in 2021, is more of an annual reminder of that which we have in our covenant walk with Messiah that can so quickly and even violently be taken from us if we're not careful. If we compromise in any way in our walk with Messiah, we run the very real risk of having the mantle of anointing, the power and authority that Abba has placed over our individual, family, and worship lives removed from us. And so Hanukkah must become more than a silly drummed up tale of menorah lamps miraculously burning for 8 days on a single cruse of oil. For anyone who chooses to focus on that lie or tale and then teach one's child these falsehoods is only asking for continued blindness to the lessons and instructions that Abba desires for his children to receive from the things he has allowed to happen to Yisrael, as told, as recorded, as chronicled in the book of Maccabees. You notice that it's not in the 66 Special King James Version. You have to ask yourself why. I think the book is phenomenal. I think that book has so much to say for us, but it's taken out. It said it's not inspired. But for us, Hanukkah must serve as a life and a spiritual lesson, a memorial, a confirmation and affirmation of that which is most important to all of humanity, the establishing and maintaining of a trusting covenant relationship we will possess and enjoy with our Heavenly Father. The most important thing. You see, the Maccabean warriors recognized from the very beginning that when they were being told by the enemy that if they would simply compromise their faith, they would be on good terms with the Antiochus government, that any level of compromise meant their lives were over. But you see, they recognized that their entire existence was their faith, the covenant they possessed with Jehovah. And so they fought without fear of losing their lives because compromise meant death for them anyway. So they had little to lose, but they had everything to gain. Everything to gain. As we see played throughout the whole of Scripture, Yah's people are always called to take the path less traveled, to abhor the paths of least resistance, to declare through our living and through our words that if serving Jehovah is not your thing, simply choose whom you will serve, be it the gods of this world or in the land in which we dwell. But as for us, as for me and my house, as for our house, we will serve Jehovah. Joshua 24:15, that has to be our rallying cry. We must have the Maccabean mindset in our walk with Messiah today. And if Hanukkah offers us any true meaning and significance, it must be this one thing. What do I have to do in order that I maintain my covenant relationship with Jehovah? Because to compromise means my covenant relationship will summarily end the second I say yes to compromise. So I cannot allow such a thing to happen. However, you are then led to memorialize or observe Hanukkah, I say do so from a perspective of spirit and truth. Yah saw fit that the Maccabean story be passed down to us for a reason. As Yah's set-apart people, we are not called to find ourselves hung up in practicing the traditions of men that only cause us to take our eyes off of our Elohim, but instead place them on men, on men's stories, on men's tales. No, not at all. Instead, let us take Hanukkah for the life and spiritual lessons it offers us as we fight the good fight, while we work the fields while it is still day and await our Master's soon return. So, if you are led to observe Hanukkah in any way, I pray that you have a meaningful Hanukkah season, however you want to call it. And if you're not, that's cool too, because it's not mandated. But whatever you choose to do, either keep or not, the principles that we are to glean from the basis upon which Hanukkah is founded, we must include and incorporate them into our lives. So I pray you have a meaningful time and that you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Until next time, take care.